you looking for a different level of truth about your challenges and struggles? Then be a part of the Yes and podcast, hosted by empowerment strategist and trauma specialist Jennifer Whitacre. Every Wednesday, we challenge conventional thinking on topics like trauma, healing, and so much more. Learn life lessons and great nuggets of wisdom from guests who've moved through their pain and suffering to discover a new purpose in life. Now, here's your host, Jennifer Whitacre.
Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer Whitacre, and you are watching or listening to another episode of Yes And. And if you enjoy this show, please share it, please subscribe, and please pass it on to the people that you know, because there's a lot of information in this show that can help you get past those times in life when you're overwhelmed, you're stressed, you're stuck, and you're just really frustrated and don't know what to do. Today's guest is Lorena Snyder, and Lorena is a trauma therapist, a child and play therapist. She's a graduate student. She's a mother. She's an Indigenous woman who works with women who have experienced violence, and she brings her own life experiences into the work she does. She helps people and children with complex trauma, and she has experienced her own complex trauma, which is what gives her the gift that she has to work with her target audience. So Lorena, it's an honor to have you on the show with us today. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, especially about child and play therapy. And I'd like to just invite you onto the show and tell us a little bit about yourself in your own words.
So, okay, I'll start with the traditional greeting of my land, which is Ina Patahao. So I'm a Diaguita woman that comes from Chile in South America. I am an Indigenous person. I was born in Chile, and due to war, I had to immigrate to Canada, and I was raised in Montreal, and that's where I learned to speak English and French. But my traditional language is Spanish, and in addition to that, Cacano, which is the Diaguita language.
Wow, fascinating. I didn't realize that you immigrated to Canada as a result of war.
Yes.
That must have been a really horrifying and challenging experience that you went through.
So in 1973, there was a coup d'etat in Chile that resulted in a major social structure and changes. And we were on the wrong side of that. My mom was forced to work in the hospital for 3 months at a time. I went into hiding. My dad had to leave the country, and he was in hiding for the next 4 years. So, and I was a year old when that first happened. So my first memories of childhood involve bombs, guns, shelters, hiding, lights out, having candles, and trying to secure our safety.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And how old were you when your family finally made it to Canada?
It was in bits and pieces. Like many people that are refugees, it was in bits and pieces. My mom was able to escape first, and I was 4 at the time. And then I resided with my family and extended members of my family for a year. Mm-hmm. And then I traveled alone at the age of 6 from Chile to Canada in a 14-hour plane ride on my own.
Oh my goodness. How brave of you.
I don't know that it was bravery. It was just what needed happening. Yeah.
Right. Well, and that's the thing about bravery. Bravery is that's what happens whenever you experience fear and you do it anyway. Like, you do what you have to do, or like, bravery can't happen without the presence of fear. It's not possible.
Indeed.
Yeah. So that's very brave and courageous. And wow. So that is quite a start to life. And and now, fast forward to where you are in life now, you're a child and play therapist. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got from point A to point B? Like, maybe help us fill in the blanks a little bit.
So it's a long story. When I first arrived in Montreal, my family always had, it would be like the immigrant mentality of make something of yourself, become a professional, do something for the society that you are belonging to. And so as such, when I was first engaged with academia, I actually studied biochemistry, because I was going to make something really practical of myself and do something really, that would contribute to society's well-being. So I had this high expectation that science was the way to go. I absolutely hated psychology. I absolutely hated social sciences because it was just too airy-fairy, mushy, emotional, all of it. And so life just has a way of folding you into the domain that you actually belong. And for me, it included traveling to India, working abroad, getting really hurt, coming back crushed, completely undone, and then having to put the pieces back together and realizing that it had to do with spirit and soul and themes of psychology and themes of sociology that started emerging.
Yeah. And when you say getting really hurt, are you talking emotional, psychological, physical?
So when I was in India, many, many years ago, I was in my early 20s, and I had this great, gigantic idea of making the world better. And so I worked in an orphanage for a year. And during that time, towards the end, obviously at the end of my stay, I was abducted.
Oh my goodness.
And I was held captive for 2 weeks. And at that time, I endured extreme violence, rape, torture. I lost time, space, everything. And I was able to escape to France, where part of my family lives as well, and start healing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wasn't a big believer.
When did you know you were safe? Whenever you got out of that, like what was the moment that you knew that you were okay, or that you survived it, or that you were finally safe?
I think it came in many different parts. I would tell you that the first time that I got on the plane and I realized I was able to escape, I had a credit card under a shoe, and I had 2 passports, and I gave one and I kept one because I had dual citizenship from Chile and France. Mm-hmm. And so I gave my Chilean passport to my captors and never said that I had a second one. So I was able to contact the embassy, seek safety. And I remember the first time that I felt safe, now not truly safe, but just the initial sense of safety. I was in the airplane in Air Canada flying to London, and I was able to have a breakfast on the airplane. And that was the first food I had that was solid food for about 2-3 weeks easily.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's when it hit me that I was able to go to the plane and feel safe. Mm-hmm. And then I arrived in France, and I stayed at my aunt's house for 6 weeks. And that's where I was able to access medical care. And that's when all of the symptoms of what we would now term PTSD really started emerging. Mm-hmm. So I was still operating on this complete adrenaline cortisol until I reached France, and about 2-3 weeks later, then it hit like a storm.
Yeah. Yeah. I can imagine. And how did you get through the post-traumatic stress symptoms?
That took, in fairness, it took about 2 years for me. And I know that different people have different experiences, but the one thing I had was this obstinate belief that this would not be my defining moment. That in a very vulgar way, the only thing I had was this impeccable rage of, you're not going to win. You're not going to win. To my captors, to all of those circumstances, this is not going to be the end of me. And that's the only thing I had, is this obstinate belief that this would not be my defining moment. That's it. I didn't have guidance. I didn't have spirituality. I had this I'm not going to crumble.
And I've heard this from people before, and there's a part of me where that resonates with my experience as well. And I just kind of want to highlight that and point that out to the listeners, because I think a lot of us who have lived through trauma and extreme forms of trauma, and abuse and inescapable attack, and being held captive against your will, those are not easy scenarios to live through. And one thing that I've noticed in common is that inner resolve, like, this isn't going to happen. There's no way. And I know that my listeners have heard me in the past say that there's this part of me sometimes that will come out, and I call it my petulant teenager. When somebody, tells me something or tries to force me into something, there's this aspect of me that pops out, and it's like, F you, watch this. I'm gonna find a way. And so there's, and I just want to point out that no matter in the worst of circumstances, if you have that inside of you, latch onto it and listen, like hang on to that. Don't let that aspect of you go, because that obstinance and that stubbornness can work to your advantage.
It really can. I mean,
yeah.
when everything is taken, and I have been there, when everything that you can possibly imagine is taken away from you, your agency is just barely existence. The only thing that you have freedom from is within your own spirit. And Viktor Frankl talks about that in his book.
Yes.
About man's essence of being, about, having absolutely no control whatsoever, about his physical circumstances, about whether he lived or whether he died. And yet still there was a resolve of him within spirit to continue, to persevere, to look for humanity. And of course, the truth of the matter is these knowledge.
And before you go on, I just want to note to any listeners who are not familiar with Viktor Frankl, that Viktor Frankl wrote the book called Man's Search for Meaning, and he survived the concentration camps in World War II Germany. So if you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it. Thank you for allowing me to interrupt, Lorena.
No, not at all. I was just going to say, I mean, I have these knowledges now of understanding my experience. At the time, I really didn't have it. I mean, it was through, in some ways, a curiosity that I had to start understanding what in the hell happened. How can I survive this? Like you were saying, and I can echo with you, the only thing I had was this big, ginormous, fuck you, I'm not going to let this be my defining moment. Beyond that, I had nothing. I had not even 2 brain cells to string together and read a sentence and remember what it was. It was gone.
Right.
And those things are things that I slowly had to relearn. And so in the absolute breakdown of everything that I knew, there was a reconstruction and a rebuild, which we could call like post-traumatic growth, which we can call exploration. And during that time, for a good 2 years, I after 6 or 8 weeks of being in France and being medically tended to by doctors and by my aunts and being safe, having the breakings and things heal and things place back together. The placing of my mind came at a later time when I had to return to Canada and start really doing the work. And the work for me involved seeing a trauma therapist who she was a Nicaraguan woman, and I saw her 3 times a week. And she was a victim of torture as well. And violence. And it's that level of being able to connect and being able to disclose and being able to recall and also being able to externalize that started piecing those things together for me.
Yeah. And I think it's really notable, and you can confirm this or not, because again, this is me thinking. So I'm kind of imagining that as horrific as it sounds, that it might have actually been a relief to have a therapist who had a similar experience. Because in my life experience, there is nothing worse than sitting with a therapist who has not experienced what I've experienced or anything similar. And so there's no relatability and there's no connection, no attunement, no safety in sharing the story and healing from it.
Yeah. And I don't know how much, I know it's a hard one to gauge, because at the same time, it becomes a little bit of a contest of battles, like, oh, how much harm did you experience and can I relate to you? But the truth is, in the moment where I was completely undone, I needed someone who would hear me in my mode, in my pain and my sorrow, and like you said, would be able to connect with me at that place, at that abyss.
Right. And
what
what
I needed someone that had enough of that experience to be able to connect with. You're right.
Right. And what I've discovered is people who have had similar and relatable experiences can hold space in that way. And it's when people have not had similar experiences, then you get into what you were mentioning, where the competitive, well, that's what you went through. Well, listen to what I went through. And this is my experience. And so it can get into those types of conversations if you're working with somebody who doesn't truly get it. If somebody gets it and they've gotten to the other side of it, now, if they're still struggling with their trauma, then you're going to have, like a dysfunctional therapist, and they exist. There are dysfunctional therapists out there. And, so I think that there are subtle ways that we can recognize whether, those therapists are a good match for us or not.
Exactly. And it's a terrible thing, because really when we're sometimes the most vulnerable is not really the time or the headspace that we have to be shopping around for therapists.
Right.
And so
Right.
often, like you said, it's a bit of an exercise of trying to open up and then closing back up because the connections aren't real, they're not authentic, and we're not growing.
Right.
And that can actually incur more harm to us in the process of healing, which we go through. So 2 years later, I start to get my mind back, in the sense that I'm able to read and retain information again. I'm able to walk alone without feeling absolutely terrified. I'm able to take the bus alone without being terrified. And slowly but surely, I start gaining agency. And I went back to school again, and I studied more biochemistry, biology. And at the time, I was completely terrified of having children, because in part of the experience I had, but also because of the earlier childhood experiences that I had during war with my parents. My parents both suffered from the effects of war, so they weren't exactly emotionally available people, and they weren't exactly able to connect with their own selves. So they did the best they can, but that also left me in harm's way a great deal of the time. So in time, I did have my first son, and I had children. And when it came time to I checked out of the workplace for a time, and I had my babies, and I really enjoyed them. And I started discovering things about myself even more through them. And I started seeing the magic and the beauty that is with the early childhood experience. So when push came to shove, I started going back to school, but not in biochemistry or not to work as a teacher, but to go towards play therapy, and understanding that, working with children with developmental differences or deficiencies or differences, as I would call them, it was easier to make gains through play than it was through negotiating. And I found that the same modality held true for us as adults and as children.
Yeah.
That when it came to our time, when it came to our time to experience distress, it was easier to access parts of ourselves that are not always accessible through talk, through play.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And I was wondering if you could tell us just a little bit more about child and play therapy. Like, just tell our listeners, what exactly is that? Is it only for children? Is it something that can be translatable to adults? And why would somebody want to look at play therapy? Like, what's the benefit? Because I can almost hear some of the eye rolls. When they hear play therapy, it's like, oh, that's not productive. I don't have time for that.
Well, the interesting thing is, in fact, it's when we are playing, when we're engaged in play, we're engaged in a way that our brain actually activates a different part of ourselves that it is not necessarily subject to all the large emotional fortresses that we've built. We tend to disarm that. We tend to be more flexible. We tend to take more risks. We engage our creativity. We engage our intuition. It also has this huge benefit of fun as well, more often than not. And that actually feeds into all of those good endorphins that people like and need. So it's a really cool technique to actually go beyond just the psychotherapy and to be able to engage the whole person. And that really, as I have grown older, is more akin to my Indigenous understanding of life, engaging the whole person as opposed to just engaging the cognitive part that may remember a part of your trauma, the body part that may remember a part of your trauma, and it's somehow still segregated from the spirit part, which is often not understood in psychotherapy. Right. And through play therapy and through an Indigenous worldview, it integrates those concepts in a way that for me makes sense. So some of the rules of thumb are that, in fact, through play therapy with a proper play therapist, you can achieve the same level of gains that you can in about 6 sessions of psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
Just because the person is a little bit more open and apt and less resistant. And you're not making the changes for them, but rather they are able to gain their own insights, and the transferability is huge.
Okay, that makes sense. And I heard Brene Brown in one of her books, I don't remember which one, talk about an anger and rage therapist. And again, can't remember his name in the moment. I just remember the discussion. And she said that this anger and rage therapist ended up changing his title to a play therapist because he discovered that the antidote to anger and rage was play, which I think is absolutely beautiful.
Well, if we think about some of the neurobiology involved in play, it's so complex. I mean, children learn intuitively through play, but we also intuitively learn how to relate to this world through play. And so it's not surprising to me that the antidote of harm is actually kindness, compassion, love. And in that flexibility is play.
Yes.
It feeds into it.
Yes, absolutely. And now what population do you work with? Like, do you work with, families? Like, who do you work with in your practice?
I've worked with all different, I've worked with children that have experienced trauma. I've worked with children that have been sexually abused, for instance, and they may not have the vocabulary even to tell you this is what occurred, but they'll be able to, in some ways, engage with you through play. And it doesn't necessarily seem as explicit as it is, but it's rather indirect. And it has to do with a little bit of that Jungian psychotherapy that you had alluded to as well, of understanding that sometimes repetitive drawings, repetitive play are actually indicating a position in our soul which we're stuck. And through play therapy, we can engage in dislocating that together. So you come alongside and you partner up with a child in all of their being, with their spirit, with their mind, and you help them in a safe way, feel connected, feel in many ways love, and feel safe enough to take those risks and to be able to, find solutions for themselves, like grounding themselves and displacing that anger with curiosity. And that's what I absolutely love play therapy for that. So I've worked with young children. I've worked with teenagers that are that engage in self-harm. I've worked with teenagers that have been sexually abused as well. I've worked with teenagers that are suicidal as well. I've worked with women who have long-standing legacies of abuse, through childhood, through themselves, through addiction. And I've also worked with family systems. And that is, I've worked with families that simply quite don't know how to relate to one another in this very mechanized world that we have. Sometimes parents don't know how to connect with children.
Yeah. I think that's been a lot of our experiences in life. I don't feel like my parents really knew how to connect with me. And when my son was young, I had some hesitation about my ability to connect with my own son when he was a young child. And just that, and the hesitation was not feeling like I had the knowledge, the competence, or the confidence in myself to be a good parent because I didn't know what a good parent was.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things I've often said is that when we weren't modeled certain sets of behaviors, when it's not something that comes intrinsically, we have to kind of create that for ourselves. And in that time, it's really difficult to find what really works and what doesn't. So I've worked with parents, and I myself have experienced it. I remember, when I was 25 or so, before I started having kids, one of the dovetail signs is I'm never going to have kids because I have no idea how much I'm going to fuck them up. If I have no premise not to mess them up. And I had this fear of having a child and them being 15 and 16 and them going to a therapist and complaining about how much I've completely screwed up their life because of all of the errors that I made. And and that was something that I had to overcome. But it was a schema that I had. It was terrifying.
Yeah. I think I still have some of that schema in me because it was maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago, the recent past. My son's a young adult now, and I went to my son and I'm like, I'm finally starting to see all the ways that I went wrong as a parent and all the horrible things that I did that I shouldn't have done. And so I sat down and apologized for all this stuff. And we had a conversation. And what was so surprising about that conversation, because I went into it all tail tucked between my legs and teary eyed. And he's like, Mom, he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, the stuff that you're talking about is not what traumatized me. And when he told me the things that were the most traumatizing to him from his perspective, I'm like, but I made those decisions in order to improve our life, or to, we moved from point A to point B because I got a better job, and and I was able to spend more time at home. And those were the moments that he found more traumatizing. So being able to see my own faults as a parent really brought us together much more closely, because I was able to see from his perspective, and I realized that I was projecting my thoughts and my experience onto him. And I don't know, have you ever had that experience? Or
I think
your kids are a little bit younger than mine, so I don't know if you've had those conversations yet.
No, well, my oldest is 19, so I've had some conversations about that. But one of the things I had to overcome through my own knowledge is that I think I had this idea of parenting perfection.
Yeah.
I think because I didn't have things that are intrinsically modeled, so I really I put so much pressure on myself to be as the best possible parent. And I remember when my son was little, I would make sure that he had all the nutritional food groups and all of the right this and all of the right that. And I would put so much pressure on myself of trying to do things that I never lived through, to model behaviors that I was never given. And that was exhausting. And thank God.
That perfectionism is so drilled into us and hammered into us in the especially North American culture, Canada, the United States. Just look at your commercials and what comes through on television. You're a good parent if you do this, but if you don't, then you're not. And so there's so much pressure that comes to us, and it comes into us implicitly. It's not within our conscious awareness. So it's like the implicit part of our mind is absorbing this over and over, that we have to be perfect. And it really does put a lot of pressure on us, and it does cause us to put pressure on ourselves.
And I think as women, it's even more so. I think that as women, we have this expectation of being a very well-formed professional, and then being a perfect mom, and all that means, and being an attentive person, and being a certain size, a certain weight, a certain color, a certain ethnicity.
Yes.
And it's all very reductive of our human experience.
Right. It is, as if there are some parts that are acceptable and some parts that aren't. And then we wonder why we battle and struggle inside our minds all the time. And we suffer from anxiety and stress and depression. And
So I think some of the greatest freedoms is at some point probably a good 12 years ago, I just started to understand, and I think that's when I started exploring play therapy. I started to understand the myth of the perfect parent, the myth of the perfect woman. And I started deconstructing that for myself, and really doing my own homework and applying it to my life, and giving myself the freedom to be weird, and to be Indigenous, and to be complex.
Yes.
And I think that was very liberating, probably for my children too, to the point where now they're not surprised by a whole lot of the shenanigans I put them through.
Right. And when you look at how our children learn non-verbally from us, because anybody who's a parent, or even if you've been a child, which we've all been children at some point, if your parents ever did the do as I say, not as I do approach to parenting, you realize how much BS that is, and how as a child you could see right through it. And if you're doing that as a parent, I guarantee your kids see through it just as well as you did. And you can see your parents' hypocrisy. And how are they going to take you seriously if you're, parenting with hypocrisy? So if you can just be who you are, like you're saying, let your freak flag fly. and your kids will learn to be who they are, so that maybe they don't have to go through the same, bottoming out that we did.
And one of the things that I find with parenting too is when I started learning about play therapy and studying in play therapy, understanding different models of parenting, from authoritative to permissive to this, and what that looks like in terms of the brain development of the child. And I owed, even my son Gabriel at the time, he was about 8, and I owed him a fair bit of apologies, because I believe that compliance was the ultimate form of parental success. And that was a lot of BS.
Yeah.
And so thankfully I was able to backtrack on that one and understand that it never felt right, being I told you to do this, and it felt like I had to do it. It felt like that was the expectation.
Right.
It's the comply. And then I realized that it never did fit. And so I'm very thankful to have been able to study play therapy, so that I was able to explore and see different ways of being.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've noticed too that, I think you and I both have learned a lot about generational trauma, and some of that trauma that gets passed down through the lineage.
Yes.
And when it comes to generational trauma, I think that cultural trauma fits in there as well. And one thing I've noticed is that just different family structures within different cultures, the trauma manifests collectively quite differently.
Yes.
Similarly and quite differently. And
if I can speak to that.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
When I was tiny, fear was something that was embedded into me as a means to procure safety. From the time that I can remember, our little nursery stories involve telling you, be afraid, because the white man will come and he will bite your feet and steal you. And your mom is working in the fields and she has no power, and she's trying to give you food and sweet treats. But you stay in your crib, stay silent before you are robbed.
Wow. And eat and bite your feet?
Yes, the white man will come and bite your feet.
Wow, that is an interesting. Okay. Do you know the origins of the biting the feet? That's one I haven't heard before.
Well, I can send you the song.
Okay.
It's a really common Spanish song, but these are nursery rhymes that we have. And they are intended to protect our children, but they speak to the intergenerational trauma. They speak to embedding fear within us. They speak to placing us from the earliest age at a defensive to a world that is going to harm us. And that can be very taxing to hold when you're trying to grow, when you're trying to exist. I mean, but in essence, it's intended to support the fact that you will be marginalized as an Indigenous person. It's intended to support your understanding that it won't be fair. You can't be hurt.
Yeah, right. And I think a lot of folk tales and fairy tales just around the world are similar in the fear that they try to instill in people. In Caucasian cultures, we have the Grimm's fairy tales, and the origins of their fairy tales were very, very violent. And the way people are portrayed in a lot of fairy tales. And you can let me know if this is true in the Chilean fairy tales or not. With what I notice in fairy tales is like the queen archetype. Anytime there's a queen, she's often very mean and, kind of like that off with her head Queen of Hearts stereotype. And that's really not what the queen represents archetypally. These stories were written by men. And whenever you put a woman in a position of power to a man, that might be how she seemed, or maybe that was intentionally written to try to knock her down a notch. I don't know. But when you think about, how much of our history and fairy tales and folk tales have been written by men, there seems to be this distortion that was almost intentionally put in for a very specific purpose, to kind of mold our, what we imagine a certain role to be in society. And so is that the same, type of approach to fairy tales?
Well, okay, so there's different lore that we carry. So in our traditional sort of Indigenous lore, in fact, our people are matrilineal. So they don't really have a patrilineal, like a patriarchal approach.
Okay.
So in our stories and our tales, women are not demoted. They're not featured less than. In fact, they are the people that work cooperatively with men to find the harder solutions, to be the givers, the thinkers, the life givers, the water. And that's sort of the essence of womanhood is very different. We listen to the cycles of the moon as being important. So those are some of the things that as Indigenous people we have. The other ones are folk tales that are sort of contemporary, and they're designed, like I said, to just keep you safe. They're designed to instill fear, and that is a legacy of colonization.
Yeah.
So I think there's sort of like two arms to this.
Yes.
Some of our traditional stories have a lot of harmony within them, and then some of the more contemporary stories are just designed to try to preserve your essence, your culture.
Yes. And, and I've always heard that Indigenous peoples around the world, on every continent, where Indigenous peoples live, that the Indigenous peoples are the record keepers of the true history of the earth. And it kind of sounds like maybe through the lore, the real stories were passed down, but then through the folk tales, then you've got the stories on, okay, here's the real story, but here's how you survive in the world as it is now.
How you survive in the world. And that's the legacy of the intergenerational trauma that I was saying about.
Yeah.
It's hearing about stories of alcoholism. It's hearing about stories of Jesuit priests that do terrible things to children. It's stories about violence. It's stories about women that go missing in the night. It's stories about mines that come and develop these large mega projects, and suddenly our girls are hurt and start to go missing. These are the parallel stories to Chile and Canada, which is where, in fact, I feel a kinship to Canadian Indigenous people here, because I recognize that the stories of colonization are parallel.
Yeah.
We too suffered through women that are going missing. We do suffer through social determinants of health that include poverty, that include higher risks of addictions, of mental distress, of harm. And they are resultant of colonization.
Yes. Yeah. And now it's my understanding that a lot of the people that you work with are the Indigenous population in Canada. Is that correct?
Yeah, I do work with Indigenous people. I wouldn't say primarily, but certainly.
Okay.
I think it is an important part of the work, because it allows me to connect with people that have suffered in similar ways, and also it's a completely underserved and misunderstood people. I mean, there just are. Indigenous people have such little voice and agency.
Well, it seems to me that we share the planet with Indigenous people, and we live in vastly different worlds, even though we might live right next to each other. And I'm wondering if you might be able to speak to that for a minute, how it's just such a different experience. And it's like, it's strange how that happens.
So because I've been in Canada for a very long time, and I understand this landscape, like I'm at my cousin's house. That's how I would think of it. I'm an Indigenous person from Chile. Here I am staying in Canada at my cousin's house. But I still relate to the same sort of process by which I am staying at my cousin's house is due to colonization as well. In Canada, one of the things that happens, and I can speak to, is what I would probably call a geographic apartheid. And that has to do with the fact that in Canada, there's a reserve system where Indigenous people can stay, and that's considered federal territory. And in its surrounding, you may remain within the state of a province, and the distance between the two spaces can be as little as 20 kilometers. And yet on a reserve, you won't have access to clean water. for no other reason than the infrastructure hasn't been created to provide clean water. This in turn causes, more distress to the people that are living there. For instance, here in Toronto, we have Six Nations, and it still has part of Six Nations that has no water, and a huge number of reserves that have boil advisories. Now, being the water-rich country that Canada is, this makes no sense whatsoever. And there have been many Indigenous scholars here that have referred to it as Third World Canada. That Indigenous people, in fact, don't have the same rights and privileges as Canadians do. They don't have access to equity. They don't have access to social justice. There's a great deal of racism that Indigenous people in Canada experience. One of the things that I've been looking at as well is the fact that Indigenous children compose only 4% of the or Indigenous people in general compose 4% of the population. Indigenous children, let's say, are 2% of the Canadian population, and yet they sum up to 55% of the children that are in care, that are in foster care. Oh my goodness. In addition to that,
that's quite a disparity.
That's huge, disproportionate.
Yeah,
and the number of children that are in care now exceeds the number of children that were placed in residential school before. So this idea of communities that are getting slowly withered away by children that are being lost to a system.
So instead of removing children from their homes and putting them in residential schools, they're removing them from their homes and putting them in other homes.
Yes, in foster care. And there are some, at this time, there are some studies that are trying to create more justice around that theme. There's a Child in Canada Welfare Society here, Indigenous Child Welfare Society, which is investigating it and has actually successfully sued the government for about 11 years standing on these cases.
And I'm curious, so if somebody decides to take in a child, an Indigenous child that's been removed from their home, here in the United States, we would call that foster care or foster parents. Do the foster parents or the equivalent in Canada, do they also get some sort of subsidy from the government?
Yes. There's so the cost of care for a child in care, in foster care, is much higher than the cost of care if the child were to remain with their families and receive support on a social structural level.
So what is really happening if the government is removing children from their homes and then paying people to take them in? Is it really truly in the best interest of the child, or is there something deeper going on that we're not seeing?
My feeling is that it certainly contributes to an erasure of a people, and it is genocidal in nature. One of the people, Pam Palmater, that I follow closely, she's a scholar at Ryerson University, will speak about the genocidal nature of erasing a people by slowly withering away at their children. So if you look at the UN Constitution of what constitutes genocide, one of the first things that it'll list is being able to remove the next generation and their capacity to live, to be free, to reproduce. And that's essentially what you're doing, because by taking a child away from their community, you're removing them from their language, from their culture, and you're slowly erasing their identity.
Right. And not to mention the generational trauma that comes from removing a child from their home and putting them, or the developmental trauma that can lead to generational trauma down the line.
There's huge developmental trauma. Yeah. There's huge attachments and connections between grandparents and children that are also being removed. So those include the stories, the lores, the folklore, the knowledge.
Right.
And that gets removed as well. There are remedial steps right now to attempt to have children being placed in Indigenous homes. There are legal steps whereby we have an emergence of legal scholars that are suing the government for this injustice, that are quite stately. I'm sorry, but this is not to our well-being. This is to our demise.
Exactly.
And we are opposing this. And so there are remedial methods. But let me just speak on one more theme with respect to the child welfare.
Okay, please do.
A huge connection between the number of children that are in care, foster care, that are in group homes and such, that are removed from their community, their ability to move forward in life is greatly reduced. So those children, oftentimes, their harm is huge, and so they don't have access to higher education. So their rates of homelessness are enormous. Mostly because by the time they reach the age of 18, they're dropped out of the system. And oftentimes I hear stories of children that are literally dropped off at a bus stop with no money to their name and no education and no training to be able to move forward in life. The rate of addiction is so much higher for children.
So just you're 18, here's the bus stop, go live?
Yes. The rate of addiction is so much higher amongst children that have been in care. The rate of suicide is so much higher for children that are in care. And when I mean geographical distribution, just take a look at our map of Canada. It's enormous. We have children that are from Nunavut, so from the high Arctic north, that get displaced all the way in towards where I live, close to Toronto. They are, 10-hour flight away from their home, and they'll be placed in a bus stop when they reach the age of 18 and expected to make it out on their own.
Oh my goodness.
So the rate of homelessness amongst children in care is enormous, staggering, which then, of course, leads to the rate of incarceration of Indigenous youth is enormous.
Right.
Which then in turn leads to the whole carceral system. And again, we have a ridiculous overrepresentation of Indigenous people.
That was what I was about to ask.
In our carceral system.
Yeah, like how many, like what's the percentage incarcerated versus the percentage of the population?
So I believe and I could be wrong on the stats, but I believe for Indigenous men, it ends up being about 27%. But for Indigenous women, it ends up being 35%.
Wow, okay.
So even higher percentage of women, Indigenous women, are incarcerated than what would be, and come again, this is, if we compare to the total population, which is Indigenous people only represent 4%.
Okay. And do you know why Indigenous women are overrepresented in prisons, much more so than Indigenous men? I'm curious if it's related to human trafficking, because it's very common to throw the, quote, prostitute in jail.
I think in part, but I don't know if exclusively. I think it has to do with the fact that the judicial system is much harder in terms of its punishment on Indigenous people, and that has to do with systemic racism. So two people with equivalent charges won't get the same sentencing, depending on their cultural background and ethnicity.
Yes, we have that in the States as well. Absolutely.
So instead of saying, causal to addiction, causal to prostitution, causal to minor crimes, what we do see is that women are often the caregivers of children as well. And so their punishments tend to be more acute because they have children.
Okay.
In addition to that. So we've seen that as well, but I'm probably going to go towards the structural racism.
Okay. Because I know that at least here in the United States, that Indigenous women are more likely to be pulled into human trafficking against their will. And a lot of times when the women, or not so much children anymore, anybody under the age of 18 who's discovered in human trafficking is in the United States is automatically considered a victim. However, if you're over 18, that's a crapshoot. You might be charged with prostitution, even if you were trafficked against your will. And minorities are more susceptible to end up in prison for that.
Yeah, I wouldn't speculate on that just because that's not quite my area of expertise, but I do know that the sentence rules are distinguished by ethnicity, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And we even have mediations, we even have remedial steps towards that. So the Canadian government acknowledged that because we have an overrepresentation of Indigenous people, we have this principle called the Gladue principle. And the Gladue principle looks at mitigating legal cases that include Indigenous people, that are exclusive to Indigenous people, in a way to understand that there are systemic patterns of harm that have been that have been created through time that create these social determinants that in turn lead to the conditioning that leads to sentencing. So basically, it's the Gladue principle is based on a case of Cindy Gladue, and it had to do with understanding that the person that does result in a violent outcome, in this case, was resultant of her experiencing long-standing trauma for an extended period of time, and that is the normalized state of most Indigenous lives, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people don't realize what it's like to live with an overwhelming amount of trauma coming at you every single day. Like, complex trauma is hard to understand if you've never lived it. And I think there's a lot of judgment that comes from people, and that's unwarranted because they don't really get what that experience is.
I think it's interesting. One of the things I found with complex trauma is that complex trauma is something that is, I think, a little bit more common than people understand it to be. We're just starting to get a grasp of what that all implies. We're just starting to understand the harm that is done to the spirit and to the soul from a young age. I mean, there are still a lot of people that will deny the impact of complex trauma. But I've seen a lot of broken people walk around denying their trauma.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because I know when we were chatting before we recorded, I was telling you I do a lot of shadow work with people. And the medium that I work with is subtleties. I don't work with the big overblown, like big heavy diagnoses of trauma. I refer that on. I work with the subtle stuff, the stuff that we write off as personality traits or behavioral quirks, or she just does that sometimes, or, oh, he gets that way. Well, a lot of times those little things that are really subtle, or, oh, she's in a mood, or there he goes again, we write it off as normal and okay, and we excuse it when it's really a result of past trauma. And a lot of times they're really surface things, and we write them off as normal and okay and acceptable, when they're toxic. Just think about standing around the water cooler at work and gossiping and complaining. Gossip and complaining they can be, they're not across the board. They can be behavioral addictions in people. And, we don't talk about oftentimes behaviors as being addictions. We don't look at the addiction to power or the addiction to control or things like that. We look at addictions oftentimes as substance, like addiction to alcohol or cigarettes or opioids in this country, or even gambling or pornography. But beyond that, we really overlook behavioral addictions. And
so too. And I think in our society, we can mask a lot of pain if we're really good at it. So we can, if our set of competency skills that we've developed to mask our pain includes being a high achieving, high performance person, gosh, that certainly looks like shining success.
Right.
But meanwhile, the person feels completely hollow inside.
Right.
And they feel like they are echoing with nobody. And, I've met people that seemingly have it all and that feel absolutely nothing.
Right. And I think a good way to, it's not the only way, but a possible way to tell if somebody like really has that emptiness and hollowness inside that you're talking about is if they are addicted to, getting the accolades and the high fives and the, oh my God, what a great job because of the high achievements, that need to accumulate more. Like, where's the end? Where does it stop? When are you satisfied? When are you fulfilled? And if there's never that fulfillment where you can,
that's right.
You know what I mean? Then
yes. And I think we talked about it before in our pre-interview that it comes back to a little bit of Gabor Mate in the realm of the hungry ghost, where you're just continuously feeding that hunger within you because it's an insatiable hole and space of your spirit because it feels hollow.
Yes. And I'm curious, are you familiar with Caroline Myss and her work at all?
I don't think I am.
Okay. Caroline Myss, her last name is spelled M-Y-S-S, but it's pronounced Mace. And I follow her work because she gets into archetypal work, and I absolutely love archetypes and the symbolism of the unconscious realm. And she talks about addiction as being a 4th, 5th, 6th chakra issue. or power center. I call them power centers, not chakras. But, our fourth power center is our heart. Our fifth one is the throat, and our sixth one is the head. And she said the head and the heart have to agree, and this is our choice. And she said whenever the head and the heart are not congruent and they don't agree, then the fifth chakra doesn't know what to do. So it makes it hard to make decisions, and we go along with things that we don't want to go along with. And until we can get congruent, then we're going to continue going on with our addictions, because she says that one thing that our head and our heart can agree on is numbing and going into the addiction. So, it might be, I've had a really bad day, I need a drink. I've had a really great day, I need a drink. So they're happy to agree on that if they can't be congruent about anything else.
And the other thing about it, when it comes to addiction and when it comes to satisfying that, hunger of our spirit and our soul, I think the other thing it has to do is our personal schema. We talked about that. And so sometimes, you can be immensely competent, but still have a personal truth, what I would call the essential truth of being valuable, of being wanted, and of being worth it. And when those schemas play, you can, behave yourself to all the success that you want, and it still will result in the person, not being able to truly feel joy.
Mm-hmm.
And so the personal schemas that I think, and that's why I like childhood trauma work and working with children, is because it's a lot easier to help children develop a personal schema of their truth. Mm-hmm. Because they have a lot less years on them where they built this immense shell around them, right, that you have to, go around and navigate.
Exactly.
Magnificent, well-adapted, complex schemas, but at the end of it, mm-hmm, we're terrified sometimes of just not feeling like we're enough.
Yes.
And not loving ourselves, or hearing, and I've met immensely competent people, and at the end of the day, they still hear that voice of their parent tell them that they are as valuable as gum at the bottom of someone's shoe. Mm-hmm. And their center of belief is rooted on that.
Yes.
So their whole growth is on this false premise, and that becomes so dangerous for our spirit.
Yes. And exactly what you said is one of the reasons why I say repeatedly, question your beliefs. It's like we have to examine our beliefs, because I've had that same belief that, I'm not worth the bubble gum on the bottom of a shoe. And, that wasn't my parents' words, but
that's my negative saying.
They use the sentence enhancers in their words a little bit more, like piece of shit was thrown in there. And, so whenever that's your belief and that's what you hear over and over again, if you don't at some point in your life butt up against that belief and question that belief and examine it and pull it apart, and it's not fun, it's not comfortable to do this. But if you don't, that belief is going to be your guiding light in life.
Yes.
And so that's where, some of this work I think is really, really valuable in helping people move forward and get beyond those stuck places that really hold us back.
Yeah, I can agree.
Yeah, absolutely. And play therapy is one thing that I haven't been doing play therapy, but officially with a play therapist, but I've been kind of incorporating more and more play into my life in the last few years. And man, does it make a difference. It's one of those things. It's like, I don't want to stop doing this stuff. I don't want to stop doing these activities that I really enjoy doing. And that's been hard during COVID because I haven't been able to engage in it. And I'm trained in body language, statement analysis. I've been trained by interrogators. And one thing that we say in the body language trainings is, one of the sayings is, move the body to move the mind. Because what interrogators have realized is they're more likely to get a confession after the interrogation is over. So whenever they're walking the person back to their holding cell or whatever, right, they're more likely to get the confession on the walk back oftentimes than they are in the interrogation room, because people are up, they're moving, their guard's down a little bit. You're not looking at each other. You're both looking the same direction. You're side by side, facing it alone or facing it together, instead of facing it alone, sort of thing.
It's interesting because it almost feels like and I can relate to what you're saying in view of play therapy, because it almost feels like you have to tangentially approach the spirit before it gathers up all of its energy to protect itself.
Right.
You have to kind of gently nudge up to the spirit before it's completely aware of you and it starts attacking you. And some of the rules of thumb that I've used in parenting, and I think that's like to the benefit of my kids and really to my enjoyment as well, is when I feel like I want to be an authoritative parent, because that's the only model that I ever heard. I take a step back, and one of the rules of thumb that I have is to engage with my kids in play before finding a solution. So what that means is, play therapy is not just looking at dolls and spending a lot of time with Playmobil. It really is putting on loud music while you're cooking and having everybody dance. And engage in that process of freeing up some of those restrictive, thoughts, so that you can get, the fresh breath of healing that can come. Because you're still always fighting against some of those large, structural, narrative exoskeletons that have kept you safe all this time.
Right.
It doesn't just come undone because, you want them to, or you've thought of them, or you read a good book. You really have to kind of slowly disarm them. And some of the best ways to do it, like you said, is through somatic movement. It's through movement.
Yes, absolutely. And whenever you think about how the body retains memory and how the body holds memory, and it's not explicit memory, it's not memory that we can recall. So it's not saying, gosh, tell me about the day you got married and, like, what was the weather like? And tell me, it's not recalling the details. It's more of our procedural memory. Like, if I hand you a bicycle and you can get on it and ride it, that's procedural memory. You don't have to think about it. And so a lot of the memory from our past traumas is in our procedural memory. And so if we can learn new procedures, because I've been doing dance lessons for the last several years. So the better I get at dance, then the more my trauma drops away, because I'm committing to procedural memories in my body that I want to be there instead of the ones that I don't want leading the way. And it really is. It's a powerful way to shift it. And this is what I call metabolizing some of that trauma, because I'm taking some of that old trauma and I'm taking the energy from that trauma and I'm turning it into something that I want for myself and that I enjoy for myself and that I have a lot of fun doing.
So essentially you're engaged in play therapy.
Yes, that's what I said. I'm not officially in play therapy. Like, I'm not working with a therapist, but
it's understanding that you're coming at it from a tangential, lateral view, a softening of our spirit that will allow for some of these worlds to emerge.
Yep. And I teach resiliency classes, which is, a way to be trauma informed and resiliency informed all at the same time, because I bring the science of trauma into it. And I've been really kind of nudging for a long time at my dance instructor to become trauma informed. I said, because I said, think about the people who come to see you. I said, tell me the average demographic. And he said, well, a lot of times it's somebody who's just gone through a major change in life. Somebody went through a divorce. I said, you're directly dealing with trauma and you don't even know it. I said, you guys need to be trauma informed. I said, and then, like, trauma informed is quite the buzzword now. I said, you might even be able to attract more people if you had trauma informed dance instructors.
Well, I also find, I've seen this, and I have not experienced this myself because I'm not a very good yoga instructor, but I have seen great success with people that engage with yoga, specifically for women that have endured physical and sexual abuse.
Yes. Because
it's a way, again, to re-ground yourself within your body in a safe way. And that's a little bit, it's a softer way than the play therapy of dance and being in an excitable state, but even in a calm state, the somatic memory, like you were saying, and releasing some of those pain and trauma through yoga has been really, really enhancing to some of the trauma work that I've done too.
Yes, absolutely. And if listeners out there, if you're interested in yoga or anything, if you can find a trauma-informed practitioner, I recommend that. And if you can't find one in your area, just go do your yoga. And, just join it and just go do it. And just keep in your mind, if anything doesn't feel comfortable or anything doesn't feel right to you, you don't have to do it. I know sometimes yoga instructors will, put their hands on people and say, I'm just going to make a little adjustment. And some people aren't okay with that. Don't make adjustments to me. And so if that's you, just gently tell your yoga instructor, if this is what you do, please don't with me. I'm not okay with that. And usually it's fine if you say it in a nice, respectable way. And so set your boundaries.
Yep.
Yep.
And coming back to prisons and carceral systems, there's a very famous, she was a survivor of a large Belgian pedophile ring. Her name is Anneke Lucas.
Okay.
And she has actually a yoga prison for women.
Nice.
And that is all of her work. A lot of her work has to do with going into prisons and helping people that are incarcerated ground themselves back into their bodies.
Yeah.
And that, again, is where a lot of the healing comes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of people don't feel safe in their bodies. So it can be quite the challenge depending on what somebody's lived through, even to get them to be present inside themselves in their bodies.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. Well, we're running out of time. And so, Lorena, I'm wondering if there are any final tips or techniques or bits of wisdom you'd like to leave with our listeners today.
I think the big thing when it comes to trauma is to be patient and be gracious with yourself. And a great deal of overcoming trauma is learning to accept yourself, love yourself, and be your own best self-advocate. Be compassionate for when you rise and be really compassionate for when you can't. Have enough curiosity to keep seeking. One day a specific strategy will work and the next day it really won't. One day, and that's not a person being flimsy, it really is just the nature of healing. Play therapy is a modality that I found because it's robust enough to withstand so many different problems, but it isn't for everybody. Some people are not able to engage with that playful side of themselves to heal. Some people understand healing through listening to music. Some people understand it through exercise. Some people understand their well-being through running a marathon. And all of that, all of those forms of healing, I think, are at times equal and at times complementary. But the process is, I think, the largest process is to be compassionate and loving with yourself. There's different spheres, there's different points in which, love the child within, get back to your true self, all these different fads that kind of come in. Right now, we're living through a fad of a lot of CBT and a lot of mindfulness, but that too will pass. And I think the essence of healing still has to be one whereby the power of the individual to find themselves and to root themselves is returned to them, where their schemas are challenged and they can reroute themselves into new beginnings. And risk-taking is the hardest thing that we can do when we have trauma, and it's the most important. And by risk-taking, I don't mean engaging in high-risk behavior. I mean risking buying a book, risking exploring, risking asking questions, listening to a podcast, getting curious about things, and not being right all the time. Being okay to make mistakes. That's about it.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Lorena, thank you so much. And if any of our listeners are interested in connecting with you, would you be okay with that? And if so, how would you like them to reach out?
Oh, I have an email that I believe I submitted.
Okay. So I will make sure I put your email in the show notes.
And if people want to access a short story that I have that's getting published, they can do so as well.
Okay. And can you tell us a little bit about where they can find that short story?
Oh, it's an upcoming publication in a magazine from the UK called Asylum Magazine. It should be, there's a web link to it, but it should be probably coming into a September issue.
Okay, and I'll put a link to that magazine in the show notes. I'll also put your email in the show notes. And it looks like your email is ldimock@icloud.com. Is that the right one?
Yep.
Okay. So for anybody who's listening, there's her email. And I hope you get a chance to go to the show notes so you can check out her short story that's coming up next month. It's really a great story. I had the honor of having a sneak peek at it, and I hope you get the chance to read it because it is a beautiful combination of both Indigenous and Western styles of writing in a short story, and I was just blown away by it. So thank you for the sneak peek. I was so honored. And for all of our listeners, I really hope you enjoyed this. There was a lot of good information in the show. If you're interested in play therapy, please look it up in your area because it can be one of the most healing things that you'll do. And I know it sounds silly. It really isn't. And maybe you don't have to see a play therapist. Maybe you can do something like I'm doing and, just go find something that you love and take lessons and learn to do something new with your body. It's amazing how healing that can be. And if you found this information valuable, please share it, please subscribe, please pass this on to other people that you think it might be able to help because this information needs to get out into the world. It's been life-changing for me. Lorena and I talked beforehand. It's been life-changing for her. And we know that if you can just face some of this stuff within you, it can be life-changing with you as well. Please reach out if you have any questions. And I'm Jennifer Whitacre signing off. I'll see you all next week.
We have just concluded another episode of the Yes and podcast with Jennifer Whitacre. For additional resources, please visit our website, jenniferwhitacre.com. Leave a review if you enjoyed the show and find it useful. Until next time, continue challenging conventional thinking and keep moving forward.